Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last talk of fall 2021. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Priyasha Saxena. Dr. Priyasha Saxena joined the Leeds Law School in 2019. She's a graduate of Harvard University and National Law School of India University. Prior to joining the University of Leeds, she was a visiting researcher at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History. Her areas of research are legal history, she's a legal historian, and her research focuses on the historical development of legal concepts and institutions within the British Empire. She's particularly interested in the relationship between international law and colonialism, and her doctoral dissertation was a history of the doctrine of sovereignty in colonial South Asia. So we are very happy to welcome you, Dr. Saxena, today. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Prabhakar and Ajita, for inviting me to deliver this seminar. And afternoon or perhaps evening to everyone, depending on your time zone. It's afternoon for me, but I guess you're all elsewhere. So thank you all for coming. I'm really looking forward to this. So my talk today is titled "The Many Meanings of Divisible Sovereignty: Princely States, British Officials, and the Indian States Committee, 1928 to 1929. It's part of a larger project on the debates over sovereignty in colonial South Asia, in which I examine the doctrine of sovereignty through the lens of the princely states. Today, however, I'm going to focus specifically on interwar South Asia, although happy to talk about the princely states in general, should you so wish, in the Q&A. So I want to start with an anecdote about a murder that took place in colonial Bombay. So in January 1925, a businessman named Abdul Qadir Bawla was shot dead in the posh neighborhood of Malabar Hill. Bawla's assailants then tried to abduct his companion, who was a woman named Mumtaz Begum. But they encountered 4 British Army officers who managed to fight them off using golf clubs. 9 men were tried for Bawla's murder, and all but 2 of them were found guilty. And that seemed to be the end of the case. But then the investigative trail led to this man, Tukoji Rao Holkar, who's the ruler of the state of Indore, one of the 600-odd princely states in colonial South Asia. The states were ruled by indigenous rulers rather than being administered by British colonial officials. However, the British did, quote unquote, advise the princes on how to rule, and they exercised certain functions on behalf of the princes. These included things like defense and external affairs. The states, however, were not considered to be British territory. They were legally distinct from British India. So on this map, then, the states are shown in yellow, while British India is shown in pink. So how then did the ruling prince of one of these states become involved in the murder of a Bombay businessman? Mumtaz revealed that she had been a palace dancer at the Indore court. She'd been abused over there, so she ran away. She started living with Bawla in Bombay. Police inquiries revealed that the assailants who had tried to abduct her and who had shot Bawla dead, these assailants were employees of the state of Indore. And the Bombay press alleged that the Indore state treasury was financing the defense of the assailants, implying that Tukoji Rao himself had been involved somehow in ordering the failed abduction perhaps on account of jealousy. The incident was extraordinarily public, right? It was perhaps one of India's first tabloid trials. And because of that, the British were forced to act. They offered Tukoji Rao a commission of inquiry to investigate his role in the affair instead of a criminal trial. Tukoji Rao, however, was furious. He vehemently argued that as a sovereign Indian prince, he was not subject to British jurisdiction. And so he wrote, rightly or wrongly, I have all along adhered to the belief that neither on the analogy of international law nor as a matter resting upon treaty is a prince of my position liable to be tried. So rather than face the commission, Tukoji Rao abdicated in favor of his son. We can read this vignette in a number of different ways, including perhaps there's something to be said about the relationship between colonized women and elite Indian men. But today I want to focus today I want to focus on the questions that this case raises about the relationship between the state of Indore and the British government. So what was the nature and the extent of the sovereign powers exercised by the ruling princes and by the British government? So, for instance, did the British have the right to try Tukoji Rao, or did he have sovereign immunity? And what exactly was the legal status of the princely states? All in all, cases like the Malabar Hill murder raised tangled questions of sovereignty, of empire, and of international law. And clearly, Tukoji Rao thought the same with his references to international law in his letter of abdication. So for a considerable period of time, international law scholars considered colonialism to be peripheral to the history of international law, right? The doctrine of sovereignty was simply a mechanism by which newly independent states were included into the world order after decolonization. But in the last couple of decades, there's been a considerable amount of scholarship that argues that colonialism was central to the constitution of international law. And this scholarship places the doctrine of sovereignty at the very heart of this relationship between international law and empire. So, for instance, Anthony Angie has described how late 19th century international law was structured around a dichotomy between civilized Europe and the uncivilized non-European other, right? So sovereignty, according to him, was defined so as to exclude non-Europeans. There's a lot of other scholarship, for instance, by Lauren Benton. These scholars have argued that this conceptualization, this dichotomy between the civilized and the uncivilized, didn't exactly clarify how entities such as the princely states, which both exercised sovereign powers and were subject to imperial authority, fit within the broader configuration. So colonial legal scholars then attempted to understand the position of the princely states through the articulation of the idea of divisible sovereignty. So, for instance, in the words of Henry Maine, a British colonial official and an author of a textbook on international law, sovereignty is distributed between the British government and any given native state. So, late 19th century British colonial officials then started to argue that the princely states possessed limited sovereign powers with respect to their territory, with the remainder being exercised by the British government. So the princely states then were seen as, they were simultaneously seen as being subject to British imperial supremacy, but they were also considered to be junior allies, right, whose rights and honor had to be respected by the British. It was this language of divisible sovereignty then that was used to entrench British imperial supremacy in the 19th century, although the princely states continue to dispute the extent of British authority over them. And as the Malabar Hill murder demonstrates, debates over the legal status of the princely states continued well into the 20th century. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. Right. And I hope that by examining debates over the states, we can see how the concept of sovereignty became both the tool and the terrain of legal and political struggle between British and South Asian actors during colonial rule. So, examining the legal arguments made by the princely states and by the British government can, I think, help to illustrate the broader history of the doctrine of sovereignty. The interwar period, I think, is a particularly interesting time for the history of sovereignty, right? Many international lawyers considered the First World War to be a consequence of a 19th century vision of untrammeled absolute state sovereignty, right? And in addition, there are scholars like Anthony Angie and Balakrishnan Rajgopal who have shown that the establishment of international institutions such as the League of Nations that became involved in state making, in international administration at this time, meant that the concept of sovereignty was in immense flux during this period, right? And because of this period of churn, perhaps crisis, if we might want to call it that way, the dominant idea of sovereignty amongst interwar international lawyers, at least, was that it could be divided amongst different bodies, including states and international institutions. But despite this sort of shared language of divisible sovereignty, interwar international lawyers use this vocabulary in very different and contrasting ways. So some international lawyers argued that parceling out sovereign powers among distinct entities created the path for using law and legal institutions to limit the exercise of state power. This is perhaps something which can be called like the legalist version of international law at this time. And in this legalist vision, lawyers advocated for the establishment of international courts to compulsorily solve or resolve interstate disputes. And a classic example of such legalists is Hirsch Lauterpacht. So Lauterpacht was deeply critical of the idea of absolute state sovereignty. He considered it to be a dogma that was out of accord with political and economic realities. And for him, absolute state sovereignty was essentially a threat to world peace. So he remained committed to the idea of the supremacy of law over politics. And he wanted to subject the totality of international relations to what he called the rule of law. So for Lauterpacht then, the role of law was to act as an effective restraint upon the exercise of political choices. And he believed that international institutions, such as the League of Nations, were key to this constitutionalization of politics, as he termed it, right? But the League, which was ultimately set up, didn't actually align with this legalist view of Lauterpacht and other international lawyers as well. Under the influence of British politicians and advisors such as Robert Cecil and Alfred Zimmern, both of whom you can see on the screen, hopefully, the League became more of a political and an administrative body rather than a legal one. That focused on the judicial settlement of disputes, right? And this is what I would call a more political vision of international order. And this political vision often empowered already influential colonial powers that occupied dominant positions within the League. And this can be seen, for instance, in the establishment of minority administrations in Europe, the mandate system over non-European territories. So for these actors then, the terminology of divisible sovereignty was useful to lay down the foundations of international institutions that could intervene in the internal affairs and the internal administration of societies, particularly non-European societies that were considered to be unable to manage their own affairs. So the same idea then of sovereignty being divisible was behind both the legalist version and the political version. So both the legal and the political projects in the interwar period for the reform of the international order were based on the idea of divisible sovereignty, just in very different ways. So as these debates demonstrate, the common language of divisible sovereignty could, and in fact was, used for very different political projects in the interwar period. And in interwar South Asia as well, the same language of divisible sovereignty was used for very different political programs. So the relationship between law and politics and the nature of sovereignty that I've just been talking about, this debate wasn't just confined to international lawyers and to politicians. So ideas of divisible sovereignty also spilled into interwar South Asia, because many people who were involved in South Asian politics, particularly the princes such as Ganga Singh, for instance, or Bhupinder Singh, British Indian politicians, they participated in these debates over international institutions, and they continued to use these ideas when it came to discussing political arrangements for South Asia. So the interwar period, apart from being a pretty volatile time for international institutions, was also a volatile time for South Asia, right? There were increasingly widespread anti-colonial protests in British India. And in the face of these anti-colonial protests, the British realized that they needed allies. They needed allies to sustain the empire. They turned to their old faithful partners, the princes, because the princes had stood by the British during earlier rebellions, example being 1857, as well as during the war. So the idea of the states as these junior allies in the imperial project received fresh impetus, and so did the idea of divisible sovereignty. It was only through the idea of divisible sovereignty that the British could claim that the states were simultaneously allies and subordinates. But it wasn't just the British who were feeling the pressure with the strengthening of anti-colonial nationalism. The princes had their own problems with the nationalists, because the more left-wing ones weren't just critical of the British, they were also critical of the princely states. So Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, referred to the states as sinks of reaction and incompetence and unrestrained autocratic power, sometimes exercised by vicious and degraded individuals that were propped up and artificially maintained by British imperialism. So the princely states then, they were caught in a bind, right? They wanted to form a closer relationship with the British crown in order to stave off these attacks from anti-colonial nationalists. But having a closer relationship with the British also conflicted with their desire to be autonomous, because this being closer to the British crown would increase the power of British colonial officials to interfere in their affairs under the guise of divisible sovereignty, something that the states were quite keen to avoid. The states also faced a quite complicated economic situation at this time. So by the 1920s, the states and British India were increasingly economically integrated with each other through a network of railways, telegraph lines, postal service, trade links. So they were bound to each other. And this is something that the states were keen to pursue. They wanted closer economic integration in the form of a customs union, for instance, because it would be economically beneficial. But simultaneously, closer economic integration also threatened the separate political existence of the states. So how then did the states decide to argue in favor of maintaining a separate political existence, having a close relationship with the crown, achieving economic cooperation, but also fending off anti-colonial nationalists? The answer was a version of divisible sovereignty. And I'm going to focus on a single incident to illustrate these debates over sovereignty in the South Asian context. In 1927, the British government set up the Indian States Committee to determine the nature of the relationship between the princely states and the British government. Bhupinder Singh of Patiala was particularly active in the proceedings. And to build up a case for the princes, he recruited a rather unusual set of advisors, including Leslie Scott, his photo is on the right, a conservative privy councillor who had a flourishing private legal practice in London. Others who played an important role included Kailash Nath Haksar, who is a powerful minister in the state of Gwalior, and K.M. Panikkar, who was the Oxford-educated whippersnapper, who was an advisor to the state of Kashmir. He was also a self-described Indian nationalist. And together, all these advisors came up with a mechanism to balance the state's desires to have internal autonomy, but also have relationships with the crown and with British India. They argued that sovereignty was divisible. So Panikkar, for instance, termed the undivided sovereign of the Austinian school to be a meaningless metaphysical conception. Sovereignty, according to him, was the complex of public powers whose division was constantly undertaken in the relation between states. And Leslie Scott argued that the princely states were sovereign except to the extent that they had specifically given up sovereign powers to other authorities, such as the crown. So, how exactly then was this division of sovereign powers undertaken? These advisors argued that the division of sovereign powers was set out in treaties, in engagements, or in other means through which the consent of the states could be determined. So all of them felt that having formal legal instruments such as treaties would limit the interference of the British to certain matters and certain matters only, specifically to foreign affairs and external and internal security. So for these advisors then, the role of law and legal instruments like treaties was to constrain political choices, specifically the choices of the British colonial power. So much like British international lawyers, such as Hirsch Lauterpacht, so it was kind of unsurprising that Lauterpacht became an advisor to the state of Hyderabad 2 decades later in their case against India at the United Nations. So this is a sort of legalist vision of divisible sovereignty, trying to demarcate authority between different types of entities using formal legal instruments such as treaties. In contrast, the official British colonial position was set out in the report of the Indian States Committee, which was published in 1929. The committee was headed by Harcourt Butler, a British political officer. Committee members agreed with the princes that sovereignty has always been regarded as divisible, but they relied on a much more flexible idea of the division of sovereign powers. The relationship between the states and the crown, they argued, was not merely contractual, but it was a living, growing relationship shaped by circumstances and policy and resting on a mixture of history, theory, and modern fact. So instead of arguing that the princes had only given up specific sovereign powers to the British, the committee concluded that the crown had the power and the duty to do all acts that were considered necessary for imperial purposes, for the good government of India as a whole, the good government of individual states, the suppression of barbarous practices, the saving of human life, and for dealing with cases in which rulers have proved unfit for their position. So for British colonial officials then, sovereign powers were divided on the basis of imperial interests, which of course buttressed imperial supremacy, since British powers over the states were then not limited to specific functions like defense or external affairs, but instead they were much more expansive. They covered pretty much whatever the British would want them to cover. So in the view of British colonial officials then, politics and policy triumphed over legal considerations. And this was in sharp contrast to princely state officials, who had a much more legalist idea of how sovereign powers ought to be divided between the British government and the states. So the concept of sovereignty then became a site of debate. Although both the princely states and the British agreed that sovereignty was divisible, the basis of the division of sovereign powers was very different. The states focused on formal consent in treaties. British colonial officials, on the other hand, focused on the much more pragmatic idea of the interests of the empire. These debates continued into the 1930s during the discussion of a possible federation of British India and the princely states. The federation never came to fruition, but even after that, the debates continued until effectively the demise of the states after Indian and Pakistani independence in 1947. So what then does this history of debates over sovereignty in early 20th century South Asia tell us about the history of international law and perhaps also the history of the Indian state? I think there are three broad takeaways from my project. The first is that international lawyers were not and are not the only ones who are engaged in debates over legal concepts like sovereignty. So the language and ideas of international law have been continuously used, manipulated, cannibalized, fought over by a number of other actors, right, including international lawyers, but also politicians, colonial officials, princes, their advisors, Indian anti-colonial nationalists. All of them were engaged in debates over the idea of sovereignty. And these debates, all these debates were engaged. People entered into these debates to resolve questions of legal status, the extent of rights, the proper exercise of powers, and perhaps most importantly, to construct an imperial and a global order that supported their interests and aspirations, right? Both the princely states and the British adopted versions of sovereignty that supported their ideas of what the world ought to look like. So that's the first broad takeaway, I would think. Second, if we focus on the differing arguments of the princely states and the British, then we can also see that sovereignty is polysemic. It's capable of being defined in many different ways. So in this case, for instance, before the Indian States Committee, both the princely states and the British government agreed that sovereignty was divisible, but they differed on how sovereign powers were to be divided amongst various authorities. So location matters when we're writing a history of sovereignty and of international law more broadly, right? These ideas mean different things to different people in different places. And finally, I think that by placing the princely states at the center stage, it can also help us to reflect on the relationship between law and empire. So colonialism was deeply generative of legal ideas, but legal historians have struggled to understand this relationship. So often law is either reduced to being a mechanism of imperial oppression, or it's a tool in the hands of indigenous lawyers to fight such subjugation, right? But law played quite a complicated role in the colonial context. And I think this can be seen in moments of conflict, like the debates before the Indian States Committee. The language of international law and of sovereignty in particular, it was all encompassing. right? It was used for both suppression, it was used for resistance, it was used for a variety of different ways. It was a shared language that was used to negotiate political power. So by focusing on the role played by multiple actors in the creation and articulation of legal concepts, we can understand that the idea of sovereignty was produced and reproduced in everyday encounters. So conflict and struggle then played quite a crucial role in the creation of the legal architecture of the world, of how the world looks like it is today. So conflict then was part of the framework. It was the very essence of imperial legal structures. Legal forms and practices then are political products. They arise out of contests of conflicting social groups, rather than being timeless and neutral arbiters of social and political disputes. So international law and more broadly, and the concept of sovereignty, I think in particular, is it's a field of conflict. It's a site of struggle, and I hope that I hope that the debates over the Indian States Committee can provide a highlight as to how participants struggled to try and achieve their aims using this language. And I think I'm gonna stop there, and I'm hoping to answer some questions, and I look forward to your insights. But thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you, Priyasha, for this wonderful presentation. I'm of course aware of your work. I've read your piece before, and it was very fundamental in my own developing my own understandings about the history of princely states. So where we are open to questions. Okay, maybe our participants are thinking, still formulating their questions. So maybe I'll venture to ask a few questions first before we have our participants coming with their questions. So could you throw some light on the point you made about the possibility of the British government post-independence joining the princely states in a federation? I ask this because as a reader of the works of Alexandrovich, who was again a lawyer, but also an international lawyer, but also a constitutional lawyer, and also an international legal historian, one of those rare academics who in the early 50s and 60s played this kind of a role. So I think because he was an outsider, a Polish, and then the British, he had, and then operating from Madras, now Chennai, perhaps he had a different vantage or different point of view because of his training and location, and he was able to look at international law, legal history of international law in Asia, and then also the relationship between princely states and the British government. So, this whole constitutional debate versus also international law. So some light on that. Thank you.
Right. So there are a couple, the federation debates, it's a great thing because I'm currently editing a chapter which I've written on federation. So this is a great way for me to try and, throw out some ideas. Right. So after this, the Indian States Committee, they published their report. And the report basically said, sorry, we don't actually agree with anything that you put forth. So we can do whatever we want, the effective conclusion of the Indian States Committee was that the British government can do whatever, right? Whatever is necessary, but necessary means necessary for the empire could mean anything. The princes were really hopeful of when they made their submissions, they were very hopeful of an outcome. They believed enough that the process would result in something for them, because their very expensive lawyers had told them, yeah, you'll get a great outcome. Didn't happen that way. So they needed a new strategy. right after the report was published. The report was published in 1929. So right after the report was published, London convened a series of roundtable conferences. Right, the first RTC was held in November 1930. Um, and originally, no one thought that the princes would play a particularly important role. The RTCs were primarily about political reform, yes, but also mainly political reform in British India. So, what kind of constitution can we have over there? What kind of political reform? Like, should we move towards some sort of self government, full independence, dominion status? What could that be? The princes sent delegations to the RTC. They were invited. The Congress boycotted the first RTC, but lots of people went there. And at the first RTC, it was the princes who put forth the idea of federation. I mean, there was a choreograph between them and Tej Bahadur Sapru, who was the leader of the Liberal Party. But they were the ones who came up with the idea of federation. And their idea of federation was, we're going to federate British India and the princely states, and we're going to form a federation of India. And I guess the first question, which when I read about this, the first question was, right, but why would you want to, right? The prince, up until now, until 1930, the princes have tried very hard to maintain their political autonomy. So why would they want to be in a federation? The answer to why they would want to be in a federation is because, again, it was an extension of the argument that they put forth at the Indian States Committee. At the Indian States Committee, they said, we want a treaty or something in order to demarcate sovereign powers. So we want to know for sure that this sovereign function, I don't know, power over railways, for instance, is exercised by the British, but the other stuff is exercised by us. And the princely states, a lot of the princes believed that a federationist constitution, a written constitution, which would demarcate these powers, would be the one which would be most beneficial to them. Because if the idea was that we want to limit the exercise of sovereign powers by a centralized authority, they felt the best way to limit the exercise of the sovereign power by the central British authority is to have a federal constitution, which will say the central government only has powers in X, Y, Z functions. So that's the original idea behind federation. That's why they wanted federation to happen. There are lots of, but that's the broad idea of why they wanted federation to happen. There were lots of internal debates as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. How close of a federation do you want? Do you want a federation? Do you want a confederation? Even though the distinction isn't entirely clear on federation and confederation. And there was also quite a lot of legal debate as to, well, look at how other federations are working. Most of them end up empowering the central government as opposed to the state governments, right? If we see federations across the world, that's how they've ended up historically. But in 1930, the main idea that the British, that the princely states had about federation was that it would limit the exercise of British colonial power. And more importantly, it would also limit the authority of anti-colonial nationalists, because by this time, the anti-colonial nationalists in British India were also they were also allying with the states people's movements in the states, which were demanding political reform. So in order to limit the exercise, limit protests, they wanted to limit the power that British India could exercise in the states. So that was the main idea behind the 1930 proposal. There were lots of proposals after that. It never really worked out. And even up until independence, actually, in 1947, by the time there were debates over over how India and Pakistan should be granted independence, the question of the states still remained, right? So the Indian Independence Act talks primarily about British India partition, what's going to be happening, but the states, there is a one section which refers to the states, but that's about agreements. But even until as late as 1947, May, June 1947, a lot of the princely states believed that they would either be independent, or maybe they might form some sort of treaty relationship, maybe with Britain itself, not even with India or Pakistan, but with Britain. They wanted a treaty relationship with Britain, maybe with India and Pakistan. So I think the common thread in all these proposals, the proposal from the Indian States Committee, the proposal of the Federation, the proposal of these treaty relationships with Britain after Indian Pakistani independence, the thing that they have in common, I think, is that they wanted to divide sovereign power so that the state would retain as much authority as possible. And they wanted some sort of textual confirmation for it. They really believed that having a treaty, something written down, would be able to ensure that they would be able to have the most autonomy. So I think that's the common thread throughout the 20th century, although they articulated it a bit differently at different points in time in the 20th century. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to what was quite a brief question. So I hope that highlights something.
Because this is legal history, a subject that, as having studied here as well, this is something that we don't do very exhaustively, right? So we do constitution history separately, but legal history still is in its infancy, I would say, in Indian legal system and also with Indian researchers. My own entry point into this debate is because I, at some point, got interested in semi-colonialism, because all of us mostly study colonialism and therefore colonialism and post-colonialism. So my point was, well, if there were situations which were not approximating completely the Indian situation of colonialism, like in Thailand or in Iran or Ottoman Turkey, these places in Asia, naturally the nature of what they received must have been different, or in fact, the centuries or decades or years of colonialism that they faced was of a very different kind. China, for instance. And that led me to think about why they behave in a particular way at this point, right? So, because so much of what we do as a state, despite India being a Hindu majority state with Muslims and Sikh as minority, etc., our constitution borrows from all over the world, ideas from all over the world, and structure is in many ways shaped by British colonialism. So the lack of colonialism will certainly impact them. And my small entry into the sort of looking at princely states is they were like let's say small kind of like minions, so really small groups of semi-colonial territories as compared to Siam or Iran. Because if you look at the British protocols about gunfires and salute, etc., and actually they had created this system of how many gun salutes you would receive as a prince or a kingdom representing a king representing a kingdom, based on how the British thought you were. So I think from 41 down to 41 or 31 and down to really zero, right? So if you look at and the British published from time to time a list actually of these princely states. So on their own, some of the princely states thought they had or maybe they acted. It's very interesting. At some of these big zamindars actually projected an image of being princely states, but they were not. For instance, in Bihar, there were no princely states. Basically, they were rich zamindars. Some of them were richer than maybe technically kingdoms in other parts of the country. So there was a different kind of a game going on there, right? And maybe for a while, some of these zamindars wanted some kind of a paper from the British trying to say, well, make us princely states.
I think, there was a really long debate in the late 19th century about this, about a bunch of cases, and like some of them ended up in court. But one of them, which I remember from the archives, is about Cooch Behar, which was, and that was exactly this: is it a state or is it an estate? Like, is it a zamindar's estate, right? So yeah, and and the thing is, it's a really important distinction, because if it's a state, British law does not apply. If it's an estate, it's part of British India, so British law applies, right? And which is why there was So if you look at the lists of princely states that have been published like across, right, the number keeps changing. And you find this is really puzzling, right? How can the number change? But the number changes is because people are trying to become a princely states, or their claim to be a princely state. The British suddenly realize, oh, this is not, this is just like some random zamindar with like, 2 acres in the back of the yard. He's nothing. Um, so, but yes, you're right. But I think again, it goes back to the legal definition of a princely state and the separate status which it sort of provided. So it's really fascinating thing about how these zamindars and the princes themselves realized that in order to gain this status, they need to claim that they are legally different. And it happened, obviously, there were bigger states for which there was no such debate, I don't know, Mysore, Hyderabad, that kind of stuff. But there were loads of other really small states in eastern and western India, particularly like the Kathiawar states in the west, and a lot of states in the east, in Odisha, for instance. There was a lot of debate about are these actually states or not? And again, it comes down to the idea of are they even somewhat sovereign? Like, do they have exercise any sovereign functions at all, or are they just landowners? Which is so. But yeah, I think it was a really fascinating debate, and it parallels, as you said, with other places across the world. So there are other semi-colonial places like in Thailand or the Ottoman Empire. I think the closest, the British, the princes themselves and the British also, they never like to draw a comparison between the princely states and other similar types of entities. The closest is possibly some of the Malay states, because they were pretty similar, and not the fact that some of them. But even then, like the India office kept writing to the colonial office and said, no, you can't draw this parallel. They are legally very different. For different reasons. I think the princely states wanted to say that we're different because they wanted to claim that they're the most sovereign, and they didn't like to draw parallels with other parts of the world. And the India office, like the British colonial people, they tried to draw this distinction is again because they didn't want precedents from other parts of the empire to suddenly be imported into India. But regardless of that, I think you can draw parallels. And initially, I think the British did draw parallels, but then they sort of stopped. They suddenly realized, no, it's better for us to try and contain the legal bits to various parts of the world. But I think it would be productive to try and do a comparative project. I think I find comparative projects quite hard to do, so I'm just going to let someone else do the comparative project.
Indeed. So no, taking from where you dropped off about Malay states. Actually, it is indeed similar. In fact, it is not very hard to find now in the light of the case between Malaysia and Singapore. Because eventually it became an issue about Johor, the kingdom of Johor, which was larger Johor than the son of Sultan. They both fought, and then the division happened. One went to the Dutch, the other went to the British, and then two spheres of influences were created, and then it's a whole process. So actually, similar as you say, but again, as you also said, the British were very careful because they, as common lawyers, the mother country of common law, they're very scared. What if people find a similarity or legal similarity that is precedent? So it was an idea they developed, but it really kind of scared them. But and I think in my limited study of the princely states, I came to the conclusion that none of them were, at least in the British eyes, as big as Kingdom of Siam or Ottomans or Iranians. In fact, Russia was also a kingdom before the Tsar was assassinated and revolution happens. But before that, it was a kingdom. The Qing China falls in 1911. So before that, also there were kingdoms. So there were kingdoms everywhere, but naturally there were kingdoms in all parts of the world. But because of centuries of colonialism, particularly in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, all of them went and underwent some change. And based on who the imperial or the colonial powers were, I think they developed, accordingly. In fact, at some point, competing powers were trying to lure, one or the other state, and then use that as a proxy for what? I mean, Tipu Sultan's whole story of how, we often hear that sort of folklore about Tipu Sultan's friendship with the French. And I always thought when I was a student of law, I still am, but when I was doing BLLB, etc., the story of Tipu Sultan's friendship with French. And then later you realize, what this meant was the French were using him, or through him, they were kind of, fighting the British. So anyone who, a smart prince would try because India was almost 90% colonized by the British, they tried to find competing Europeans who support their claims. So not just so your study, I think, is within the empire, but if you step out and see what the French were doing, for instance, not the Portuguese so much, although again, the Portuguese matter went to the ICJ in the right of passage case where they, the Marathas were, contracting, outsourcing some of their work to them. So they also worked as mercenaries, maybe their agents, maybe the company directly or not, but really a mosaic and patchwork of imperial game, chess game, and the number of princely states is far too many to actually read them, read all of them, but we try to sort of put them in boxes and try to see if, they could be studied. So again, as I am studying this subject, I've learned a lot from you. Again, so second round of asking questions from the crowd. And do we have questions? Okay, not yet. Again, the one obvious country that you have not named so far, and I'm working on it actually as we speak, is Nepal. Nepal was a semi-colonial state. It was a huge kingdom, and unlike the Mughals or the Marathas, they continue to remain princely, kingly kingdom. And the democracy came only 2020, I think, two decades ago, or they struggled, and I think 2010 and then 2015 they had a constitution. So again, so close. I mean, India touches borders with Nepal, in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar.
I think Nepal and Bhutan are interesting cases because the British somehow considered them different than the princely states, right? So if you look all the lists of princely states, they will not include Nepal or Bhutan, and there's some I mean, maybe I think in the Imperial Gazetteer, I think they were listed, but later on they disappear,
because
they were dealt with by a different part.
Higher than because perhaps they were seen higher than regular Indian states. So Nehru made it clear, for instance, that Bhutan. No, it was Bhutan? Was it Bhutan or Nepal? That I think Nehru always maintained that Hyderabad or Kashmir were lower than them actually. If you
I'm not sure which one that was, but the British themselves saw, largely because they saw them as mostly independent, except somehow under our vague protection. For the princely states in South Asia, they had a legal concept called paramountcy. Now, no one knows what that meant, but there was a legal concept to define it. And paramountcy was never applicable to Nepal or Bhutan, for that matter.
True.
So, and they were always ambassadors who were exchanged, and so they were considered to be more sovereign, I guess, or more independent than the princely states. I think it would be worthwhile talking a little bit about, thinking a little bit more, some work which I haven't done, as to how these legal distinctions were drawn between, entities that seem quite similar to each other, actually. But I think it would be quite fascinating to do.
In fact, I'm trying to, I'm currently, as we speak, studying Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim. And I'm trying to understand how their semi-colonial status, again, with my own lens of semi-colonialism, which primarily for me was, Thailand. And then from there, I'm sort of coming back and trying to, see how Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim were differently placed within the empire, and how, what was the basis of their relationship with the East India Company. One thing that I have been able to find is that actually much of what happens in Nepal happened in Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim had to do with their relations with China, because Nepal for some time, I think in 1791, became a tributary of China. and it was only with the arrival of the British that in 1815, by the Treaty of Sugoi, there's a gradual shift from being a Chinese tributary to sort of shifting to the British, because British, of course, has had better power. And and if you look at the date of 1815, Treaty of Sugoi between Nepal and the East India Company, and then you think about what is happening next, that is Opium Wars, right? A different kind of relationship emerges, where not just the big states, but also the British policy of recruiting locals to fight their wars, Gurkhas from Nepal, right? Then sort of, creating sort of these races, martial races, and all of that happens actually. So then this becomes like a big place to recruit for the wars of empire, where the Sikh and the Gurkhas are fighting for the British on Chinese front. So a very different story of semi-colonialism emerges in the relationship between the East India Company and these Himalayan states, as I call it. So actually, I'm also working on this now.
I'm looking forward to reading that.
Yes, on the using the semi-colonial lens. Okay, so let's see if we have more questions. Questions? Because the topic that you're researching is in a way not so common for the law school, actually, for sure. Legal history, as I said in the beginning, isn't the strongest thing, and in fact, if you look for legal historians, there are only a handful of them, Indian legal historians or legal historians studying India's.
Yeah, that's changing. So
for sure it is changing. Yeah. I think that's why we didn't have so many questions today.
No, it's fine. It's been really fascinating. I've learned quite a lot from your insight. I think I do think comparative work is necessary and important. So I'm really looking forward to your project. And thank you for your questions. It's been a privilege.
All right. So looks like we have come to the end of our conversation today. Today was the last of the talks we have been organizing this fall. It was very enriching, as I said. And Aman has also mentioned in the chat, it was he quite enjoyed it. And with that, we come to the end of today's talk and the series that we hosted this fall at the Jindal Global Law School, which was in collaboration with the Asian Society of International Law. We look forward to your work, Priyasha, and we also look forward to a continued conversation on this. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, of course. Thanks. Thanks very much. It was great to see all of you. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.